It began with a whisper from the void. The signal first appeared as an irregular distortion, a faint pulse detected by the Deep Space Array in the Atacama Desert. Dr. Helena Voss, lead astrophysicist at the SETI Institute, initially dismissed. It is background radiation. Cosmic noise was common. But something about this anomaly gnawed at her. The frequency wavered in a precise, almost deliberate pattern, repeating at intervals too structured to be random. She ran the data through a spectrographic analysis, stripping away the interference of cosmic radiation. What emerged was chilling. The signal carried a rhythm, one that matched no known celestial phenomenon. Within hours, the world's most advanced observatories were locked onto the anomaly, triangulating its source. It came from beyond the Kuiper Belt, moving toward the solar system with impossible speed. The discovery leaked. News stations flooded the airwaves. Humanity may not be alone. At first, the world erupted with hope. Some called it the greatest moment in history, the long-awaited proof that intelligent life existed beyond Earth. Scientists speculated on possible meanings. Linguists debated ways to interpret the signal. Religious leaders clashed, some declaring it a sign from the heavens, others warning of divine reckoning. Social media swarmed with theories, some wild, some terrifyingly plausible. But beneath the surface of excitement, an unease settled. Then, the signal stopped. Not faded, not distorted, simply gone. And then the sky changed. The arrival a month after the last transmission, telescopes picked up movement beyond Neptune. At first, they were mistaken for asteroids, shapeless voids against the backdrop of stars. But, as their trajectory aligned with the inner planets, the illusion faded. These were not space rocks. They were ships, massive constructs, some the size of entire cities, drifted into the solar system with impossible precision. Their exteriors were dark, almost absorbing the light around them. Their surfaces jagged like obsidian blades forged by unseen hands. They moved in absolute silence, their forms shifting in ways that defied human understanding. Part mechanical, part organic, as if they were grown rather than built. Panic rippled through the scientific community. Satellites zoomed in on their structure, revealing eerie, pulsating veins of bioluminescent energy coursing through their hulls. These were not just vessels. They were something else, something alive. Governments scrambled to respond. The United Nations Space Defense Initiative, UNSDI, convened an emergency session. The world's greatest military minds debated strategies. Would they communicate? Would they prepare for war? Then came the realization that shattered any illusion of peace. These ships were not slowing down. They had no hesitation, no pause for dialogue, no response to the thousands of transmissions beamed at them in every known language. The fleet continued its relentless course toward Earth. Global reaction. The world held its breath as the first ship crossed the orbit of Mars. Some clung to hope. Perhaps these beings were merely observing. Perhaps they came in peace. Perhaps they simply did not yet understand how to respond to humanity's transmissions. But those illusions began to crumble. Across the globe, defense systems activated. The UNSDI issued a Level 10 planetary alert, the highest threat classification ever recorded. Every satellite network, every military command, every power on Earth was put on standby. The International Space Station was evacuated. Fighter squadrons scrambled to launch. Missiles were readied. The streets filled with protests, vigils, riots. Religions fractured. Economies trembled. Entire nations declared martial law. Some sought to flee into bunkers. Others gathered in public squares, waiting for the historic moment when humanity would finally meet its cosmic brethren. Yet, in the cold vacuum of space, the alien fleet moved without a single deviation. Then, the first ship entered Earth's orbit. The silence before the storm at precisely 12:04 a.m. UTC, an unnatural stillness descended upon the planet. Without warning, every satellite, every radio transmission, every form of digital communication simply stopped. Entire power grids failed in an instant. City lights flickered and died. Planes lost contact with control towers. The internet collapsed. Then, the sky darkened. A great shadow eclipsed the stars as the alien mothership positioned itself over the Pacific Ocean. No lights, no signals, no discernible movement. For a full hour, nothing happened. And then, a beam of light, brighter than the sun itself, erupted from the belly of the mothership. It speared downward, striking the heart of Tokyo. A fraction of a second later, the city was gone. Not burning, not crumbling. Simply gone. Millions of lives wiped away in an instant. The world had its answer. The invasion had begun. There was no time to grieve. The world watched in stunned horror as the live satellite feeds flickered and died. Tokyo, a city of nearly 40 million souls, had been erased from existence. Not bombed, not incinerated, not reduced to rubble, but utterly disintegrated. What remained was a blackened glass-like crater where once stood the beating heart of Japan. The moment was broadcast across every remaining functioning network. News anchors went silent, their faces drained of color. The collective shock of humanity reverberated across every city, every town, every home. Scientists scrambled for an explanation. Was it a directed energy weapon? A form of antimatter detonation? The answer didn't matter. The result was clear. The attack was surgical, final, and absolute. Then, the mothership moved. It was as if the destruction of Tokyo was merely the first note in a calculated symphony of annihilation. The massive vessel, its dark hull still pulsating, with an eerie bioluminescent glow, reoriented itself toward the next target. From its underbelly, smaller craft began to detach, sleek, jagged ships that moved with terrifying precision, descending toward the surface like metal predators descending upon prey. And then, all across the planet, the invasion began. The fall of the cities, it was not war. War required two sides. What followed was slaughter. The Veldrath did not fight like human armies. They did not advance in formations, did not bomb from the safety of the stratosphere. Instead, they descended like reapers, their crafts diving into the heart of Earth's greatest cities, unleashing an onslaught that defied comprehension. New York, London, Beijing, Moscow. No nation was spared. The first wave of the assault came, with electromagnetic pulses that rendered modern technology useless. Fighter jets fell from the sky, their engines reduced to lifeless husks. Tanks became little more than metal coffins. Communications were severed, governments left paralyzed as the very infrastructure that held civilization together collapsed in an instant. And then the harvesters came. These were not war machines in the conventional sense. They moved with an eerie fluidity, biomechanical constructs that slithered across the ruins of fallen cities. Their limbs, serrated and insectoid, reached for anything that moved: humans, animals, entire buildings. A single swipe could tear through steel. A single touch could strip the flesh from bone. The worst part wasn't the destruction. It was the absence of bodies. Wherever the Veldrath machines passed, there were no corpses, no remnants of the fallen. Those taken did not die in battle. They simply vanished, consumed by the living machines as raw material for something unseen. The world fights back, but humanity had not gone quietly into the void. Within hours, the remnants of the world's militaries launched a desperate counteroffensive. The United States, China, Russia, and the European Union, bitter rivals only days ago, united in a final act of defiance. Nuclear silos were unlocked. Ballistic missiles soared into the sky, carrying the last hopes of mankind. They never reached their targets. The Veldrath had anticipated every move, intercepting the warheads with pinpoint accuracy. The detonation sequences were disrupted before they could unleash their fury. The Earth's most powerful weapons were rendered irrelevant before they could even make an impact. Still, humanity refused to surrender. What remained of Earth's air, forces took to the skies. Fighter pilots, knowing they would not return, flew headfirst into the enemy armada. Some managed to land direct hits, taking down smaller vessels in a blaze of fire. Others were eviscerated mid-air, their aircraft crushed like paper in the grasp of invisible forces. On the ground, soldiers fought street by street, wielding what little remained of modern warfare. RPGs, high-powered rifles, even makeshift explosives, were deployed in a desperate attempt to slow the invaders. Cities became battlegrounds, skyscrapers turned to smoldering ruins, but for every alien craft that fell, 100 more descended. It was a battle of attrition that humanity could not win. The collapse of civilization. Within 72 hours, half the world's population had been eradicated or taken. Governments fell, world leaders went silent. The White House, the Kremlin, the Forbidden City, all reduced to craters. The internet, once the lifeblood of human civilization, was nothing more than static. Millions fled to underground bunkers, abandoned subway systems, deep caves, anywhere that could provide shelter. But even there, the harvesters came. No place was truly safe. In the ruins of Paris, a mother held her child close, whispering a lullaby as shadows loomed over them. In Johannesburg, a gang of survivors fought against a single Veldrath drone, wielding knives and iron bars, knowing they would not live to see another sunrise. In the ashes of Los Angeles, General Elias Cade, the highest-ranking officer still alive, gathered the last remnants of Earth's military. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with something deeper. Defeat had never been an option, the beginning of the resistance. From the ruins, a new kind of war was about to begin. If humanity could not fight conventionally, they would fight another way. Cade and his surviving forces began developing a new strategy, not one of direct confrontation, but of survival, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, disruption. He had fought in wars before, but this was not a war. This was extermination. And yet, in the darkest moment of human history, something stirred. The Veldrath had made a fatal mistake. They had assumed humanity would break, that fear would paralyze them, that the slaughter would end resistance before it could begin. They were wrong, because humanity, fragile and chaotic as it was, had one trait the Veldrath did not understand. They refused to go extinct, and so, as the world burned and the sky was choked with smoke, the last remnants of mankind prepared for the fight of their lives. Not for victory, not for vengeance, for survival. The old world was gone. The cities that once pulsed with life were now silent wastelands, their streets littered with the broken remnants of a civilization that had fallen in days. The air was thick, with the acrid scent of burning steel and scorched earth. The sky, once dotted with satellites and aircraft, belonged now to the invaders, but beneath the ruins, humanity still breathed. The first days after the invasion had been chaos. People scattered, leaderless, desperate. Those who survived had done so not through strength, but through sheer will. It was not armies that remained, but individuals. Scattered bands of civilians, fragmented military units, and outcasts clinging to whatever life they could find. Yet, even in the face of extinction, a fire still burned. The rise of the resistance, deep. In the heart of the Rocky Mountains, in an abandoned NORAD bunker, General Elias Cade gathered the remnants of Earth's military leadership. Former admirals, high-ranking intelligence officers, hardened soldiers, men and women who had survived not because of luck, but because they refused to die. The command center was a shadow of what it once had been. The walls were scarred with damage from the first EMP wave, the power grid barely operational thanks to backup generators running on scavenged fuel. Maps of the world were spread across the central table, covered in red markings. Every major city crossed out, every military installation reduced to rubble. But amidst the devastation, something crucial had been discovered. The Veldrath had a weakness. It wasn't in their technology. It wasn't in their weapons. It was in their structure. The Veldrath were not a chaotic, war-hardened species. They were conquerors of lifeless worlds, dominators of primitive civilizations. But they had never faced an enemy like humanity. An enemy that did not surrender, that did not abide by rules of war, that did not fight for conquest or ideology. Humans fought for survival, and that made them unpredictable. Understanding the enemy through battlefield analysis and intercepted Veldrath transmissions, Cade's team uncovered a critical truth. The alien invaders operated under an ultra-centralized command structure. Unlike humans, who adapted and improvised under pressure, the Veldrath were rigid. Their war machines, their drones, even their soldiers. They all relied on a vast, interconnected network controlled by a single, unbroken chain of command. Sever the chain, and the army would fall into disarray. It was a system built for efficiency, for the seamless subjugation of lesser species. But it was also a liability. The Veldrath had never needed to think on their feet. They had never needed to innovate on the battlefield. They did not expect resistance from a species so primitive by their standards. That assumption would be their undoing. Guerrilla warfare. Begins, Cade devised the first offensive maneuver. Not a battle, not an all-out attack, but something far more insidious. Humanity would become ghosts. The old ways of warfare were useless. Tanks were obsolete. Fighter jets were scrap metal. Large-scale military formations were nothing more than slaughterhouses. Instead, the survivors became saboteurs. Across the shattered remains of the world, pockets of resistance formed. They operated in secrecy, striking in the dead of night, vanishing before the Veldrath could respond. They learned to use the enemy's own weapons against them, salvaging alien technology from downed ships, reverse engineering it with scavenged Earth components. A missile launcher crafted from repurposed Veldrath plasma cores. A sniper rifle that fired depleted uranium rounds, capable of punching through the exoskeletons of their foot soldiers. Booby traps, ambush tactics, underground tunnel systems. Anything that could give humanity even the slightest edge. The Veldrath, for all their power, struggled to adapt. Their forces were designed for swift, overwhelming conquests. They were not prepared for an enemy that struck from the shadows and disappeared into the ruins. The cost of defiance. But defying annihilation came at a price. For every successful attack, the Veldrath retaliated with terrifying force. Entire cities were burned from orbit in their hunt for resistance cells. Survivors were rounded up and taken, their fates unknown. The enemy did not capture prisoners. They did not negotiate. They did not even attempt to decipher human language. To them, humanity was nothing more than an infestation to be eradicated. Cade watched as reports came in. The fall of Paris, the destruction of Johannesburg, the final radio transmission from the remnants of the Russian military in Siberia. Each loss was a dagger to the heart, but still, they fought on, because they had no other choice. The turning point. The Battle of Site 47. The first true victory came in an unexpected place, an unassuming Veldrath research outpost, buried deep within the Andes Mountains. Known to the resistance as Site 47, the facility had been established to study human physiology, why humans fought, why they refused to break, why their biology resisted certain forms of Veldrath subjugation. Cade saw an opportunity. A team of elite fighters, armed with scavenged Veldrath weaponry, infiltrated the facility under the cover of a massive storm. Moving through the corridors, they discovered the horrifying truth. Thousands of humans, suspended in liquid-filled chambers, their bodies dissected and studied. But they also found something else. Data. The Veldrath were not invincible. For all their power, for all their technology, they had weaknesses of their own. Oxygen-rich atmospheres corroded their armor over time. Certain frequencies disrupted their neural communication. Their organic machines, despite their resilience, could be infected, hacked, manipulated, and most crucially, they needed their command structure intact to function efficiently. Site 47 was the first domino to fall. The resistance not only destroyed the facility, but they also stole its data, broadcasting intercepted Veldrath weaknesses to every remaining resistance cell across the world. For the first time since the invasion began, humanity wasn't just surviving, they were fighting back. A new phase of war. The Veldrath felt it. They had expected a swift conquest. Instead, they found themselves bleeding. Slowly, but undeniably. For the first time in recorded history, an invaded species had resisted them longer than a single week. Humanity had done the impossible. But the war was far from over. Because as Cade studied the stolen data, a horrifying truth began to emerge. The Veldrath were not just here for conquest. They had done this before. To other worlds, to other species. Earth was not the first. It was merely next. And if the Resistance had any hope of stopping them, they needed to strike at the very heart of the invasion. The Veldrath Command Center, on the dark side of the moon. The war for Earth had entered a new phase, and humanity's final fight was just beginning. Beneath the ruins of a world teetering, on the brink of extinction, the final remnants of human resistance had found their purpose. No longer were they scattered survivors fighting merely to exist. Now, they had a target. A weakness. The Veldrath war machine, so relentless in its destruction, was not omnipotent. Their centralized command structure, a system designed for absolute efficiency, had become their greatest flaw. If the Resistance could strike at the heart of their control, they could cripple the invasion entirely, and that heart lay in a place no one had expected. The dark side of the moon. The plan. A strike against the gods. The stolen data from Site-47 revealed something crucial. The Veldrath had not established a permanent presence on Earth. They were not colonizers, not yet. They were exterminators, and they operated from an orbital command station hidden within the moon's shadow. This was no ordinary warship. It was the Hive, a vast living construct of alien biotechnology, part spacecraft, part planetary control hub. From here, the Veldrath coordinated every strike, every attack, every movement of their forces across Earth. Their entire war effort depended on it. If humanity could destroy the Hive, they wouldn't just buy themselves time. They would break the invasion itself. It was an impossible task. The Hive was heavily fortified, protected by an armada of warships, automated defenses, and something far worse: the Overseers. These were the architects of Earth's downfall. Unlike the mindless foot soldiers and drones that carried out the invasion, the Overseers were the true rulers of the Veldrath war machine. Towering creatures of living metal and pulsating flesh, they moved like specters through the corridors of their vessel, directing the slaughter with a will as cold as the void itself. To reach them, the Resistance would have to do the unthinkable: infiltrate the Hive using stolen Veldrath ships, disable its planetary control systems before the invaders could react, destroy it from within, a mission that, if successful, could turn the tide of the war. But failure would mean the end of humanity, preparing for the impossible. The Resistance had neither the numbers nor the firepower to wage a direct assault. A fleet battle against the Veldrath was suicide. Every attempt to engage them in open space had ended in annihilation. Instead, they would need subterfuge. They had spent months salvaging technology from fallen enemy ships, learning the intricacies of their propulsion systems, their weaponry, their communication networks. Now, that knowledge would be put to use. A strike team, composed of the best pilots, engineers, and fighters humanity had left, would hijack a captured Veldrath transport ship and use it to breach the Hive's defenses. The team was small, only 12 soldiers. They were not the strongest. They were not the most experienced, but they were the ones who refused to die. Each had lost something to the invasion: a home, a family, a reason to ever stop fighting. Their leader was Captain Arya Vale, one of the last surviving combat pilots from Earth's devastated air forces. Once a decorated ace, she had witnessed the fall of New York from the cockpit of a burning fighter jet. Now, she flew with the knowledge that every battle could be her last. Beside her was Dante Kova, a former engineer who had cracked the secrets of Veldrath weaponry, turning their own tools of war against them. He had built the Resistance's first functioning plasma rifle using nothing but scavenged parts and sheer defiance. And then there was Reyes, a ghost from the old world, a man who had once commanded special operations teams before the war. No one knew how many battles he had fought. No one knew how many he had lost, but his presence alone was enough to remind the team that, no matter how impossible the mission, they were not dead yet. The infiltration begins. The plan was set. The team boarded the stolen Veldrath transport, its hull refitted with primitive human ingenuity, patched wiring, modified engines, a crude but effective cloaking system designed to mimic the energy signatures of an actual Veldrath ship. They launched in the dead of night, slipping through the wreckage of Earth's orbital graveyard, the remains of satellites, fallen warships, the silent debris of a world that had once reached for the stars. As they approached the hive, its true scale became apparent. The station wasn't built, it had grown. A mass of interwoven organic tendrils and metallic plating, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly glow. Hundreds of docking bays stretched along its surface, where alien vessels moved like insects crawling across the skin of a sleeping god. And at its core, the overseers waited. The ship's scanners detected no immediate threat. To the Veldrath, this was routine, another transport returning from the surface with harvested resources. The deception held, for now. Inside the hive, the nightmare unfolds. Once inside, the strike team moved fast. They navigated the vast, dimly lit corridors, walls of glistening biometal, shifting as if the station itself was alive. The air was thick with something unnatural, a hum that vibrated through their bones, the very essence of the hive whispering in frequencies beyond human perception. But there was no time for hesitation. Kova located the control core, a network of pulsating conduits that connected the hive to the invasion fleet. This was their target, the brainstem of the entire operation. Destroy it, and they could cut off Veldrath forces from centralized command. But the overseers had sensed them. From the depths of the station, they emerged, twisted beings of shifting, metal and flowing light, their forms unfixed, their voices like a chorus of distant screams. They did not move like living creatures. They did not attack in a conventional sense. Instead, they unmade reality around them. Weapons malfunctioned. Gravity warped. The air itself became a prison. And one by one, the strike team fell. The sacrifice, it was Kova who made the choice. With his final breath, he overloaded the core, channeling all remaining power into a chain reaction that would spread through the entire hive. Vale screamed at him to stop, but it was already too late. In his last moments, as the overseers closed in, he smiled. Make it count. And then, the station began to die. The first victory, from Earth. Survivors saw it. The black void above them igniting as the hive ruptured, its organic framework tearing apart in a cascade of burning light. The command network collapsed. Across the planet, Veldrath forces staggered. Their movements faltered. Their perfect synchronization shattered. For the first time since the invasion began, the enemy was vulnerable, and humanity did not waste the opportunity. Cade and the Resistance launched an all-out planetary counteroffensive. Makeshift armies emerged from hiding, striking at the disoriented alien forces. The Veldrath felt fear. For the first time, they realized they had underestimated humanity. And now, they were bleeding. The war was not over, but the tide had turned. Humanity's final fight had just begun. The explosion that tore through the hive sent shockwaves through the darkness of space, a silent but undeniable signal. Humanity was still here. For the first time since the invasion began, the Veldrath war machine hesitated. Their synchronization, the perfect, terrifying efficiency with which they had dismantled Earth's defenses, was broken. Without the hive's centralized command, their forces were no longer omniscient, no longer invincible, and humanity was ready to strike. The first counterattack across the battered world, hidden bunkers, came alive. Underground resistance networks that had once fought in isolated cells coordinated, their messages no longer drowned out by the overwhelming presence of Veldrath surveillance. From the ruins of old military installations, artillery that had once been useless against the enemy's relentless swarms now found purpose. Targeting beacons were recalibrated, drones repurposed, and communication lines restored. In the cities, where alien patrols had once moved unchallenged, the Resistance began their harassment campaigns. Ambushes in the crumbling streets, hit and run. Attacks against disoriented enemy squads. Sabotage missions deep behind enemy lines, disrupting their supply chains. Hijacking of fallen Veldrath weaponry, using their own technology against them. The humans fought like ghosts. They did not stand and face the enemy in open battle. They became the shadows. And the Veldrath, creatures of dominance and order, were not prepared for chaos. The Veldrath response. The emergence of the Warbringers, the overseers that had perished within the hive, were not the only ones of their kind. Deep within the cold void, they stirred. The Veldrath did not respond to adversity with retreat. They were adaptive, predators who had consumed 100 worlds before humanity ever reached beyond the moon. And now, they unveiled their next evolution: the Warbringers. No longer did they rely solely on automation and hive-based coordination. These new entities were not commanders, but warlords, independent, autonomous beings with singular purpose. Each Warbringer was the culmination of eons of conquest, a fusion of alien intellect and biomechanical destruction. Unlike the Overseers, who ruled from the shadows, the Warbringers descended to the battlefield themselves. They were walking cataclysms, towering constructs of shifting metal and living energy, each capable of leveling entire cities alone. Their presence turned every battle into a slaughter. The fragile victories humanity had seized began to collapse in the wake of their arrival. What good was an ambush when the enemy could not be killed? What good was sabotage when the Warbringers could rebuild themselves in seconds? Wherever they marched, human resistance fell apart. The war had not turned in humanity's favor. It had merely evolved. A new kind of warfare. But if the Warbringers had been designed for overwhelming force, humanity had something else: adaptability. If a city was lost, they did not hold the line. They fell back, drew the enemy into labyrinths of ruined streets and collapsed buildings. If conventional weapons failed, they turned to the unconventional. They studied the Warbringers, analyzed every battle, every movement. The resistance discovered subtle vulnerabilities, not in their armor, not in their weapons, but in their very design. The Warbringers could regenerate, but only if their power cores remained intact. They could not coordinate like the old Veldrath forces. They were independent, arrogant, and territorial. And most importantly, they could be baited. The fall of Titan. Humanity's first giant slayer was in the ruins of Titan's Gate, a former megacity turned graveyard that the first Warbringer fell. The resistance lured it in, forcing it to chase them through collapsing skyscrapers and shattered highways. They studied how it moved, how it thought. Then they set the trap. They had discovered something unexpected. The Warbringers' cores did not just power them, they connected them. Each was an individual, but they still carried traces of the old network, echoes of the hive that once commanded them. And that meant they could be hacked. Dante Kova had died aboard the hive, but his work had not. His stolen Veldrath technology was the key. Using salvaged data, the Resistance managed to send false signals into the Warbringers' systems. For mere seconds, it hesitated, long enough for a team of demolition experts to detonate charges at its weakest points. The Warbringer collapsed, its colossal form toppling into the ruins like a dying god. Humanity had slain their first giant, and now they had a blueprint, the turning point. The fall of the first Warbringer was not just a victory, it was a message. The Veldrath had unleashed their ultimate weapon, and it had not been enough. Across the world, resistance cells rallied. They replicated the technique, refining it, learning to turn the Warbringers' own systems against them. Where once they had hidden, now they hunted. The Warbringers, once symbols of the Veldrath's absolute power, became their weakness. For every Warbringer that fell, humanity grew bolder. They did not fight like other species the Veldrath had conquered. They refused to die the way they were supposed to. The Veldrath, for the first time in their history, faced an enemy that learned faster than they could adapt. The war was no longer one-sided. It was escalating. And something else was coming. Something even the Veldrath did not expect. The war had changed. What had begun as an extermination had become something else, a battle neither side had ever fought before. The Veldrath had always been conquerors, reducing entire civilizations to dust in weeks, sometimes days. No species had ever survived their onslaught for this long. And yet, humanity had done the impossible. They had endured. They had learned. They had turned the very weapons of their oppressors against them. The Warbringers, once the embodiment of the Veldrath's overwhelming might, had fallen. Not all of them, not yet, but enough to make the Veldrath rethink their strategy. And that was when the Overseers returned. The arrival of the Apex from the depths of space, something new descended upon Earth. At first they were mistaken for warships, monolithic structures, the size of mountains, moving with the slow, deliberate inevitability of death itself. But these were not vessels. They were the apex, the highest caste of the Veldrath, the rulers of 1,000 dead worlds, the true architects of the genocide unfolding across Earth. Unlike the Warbringers, who were mere tools of destruction, the apex were something more, entities that had transcended the physical limitations of their kind. They did not speak. They did not move in ways that made sense. They simply were. Wherever they descended, time itself seemed to distort, as if reality struggled to contain their presence. Their forms were ever-shifting, a fusion of liquid metal and pulsing energy, neither wholly mechanical nor entirely organic. They did not command the battlefield. They became the battlefield. Where the Warbringers had been titanic warlords, the apex were living gods, and humanity was about to face the wrath of divinity. The Battle of the Abyss. The first apex arrived over the remains of what had once been Tokyo. The city was already a ruin, a skeletal husk of shattered skyscrapers and streets lined with the wreckage of failed resistance. But what came next was something else entirely. As the apex touched down, the air itself warped, the sky darkened, not from smoke, not from clouds, but from a presence. Every piece of human technology within 100 miles failed simultaneously. Engines stopped, weapons locked. Even the very ground beneath the survivors shifted, as if rejecting their existence. And then, the apex spoke. Not with words, not with sound, but with thought. A raw, overwhelming force of intent that ripped through the minds of every human in range. We have watched you struggle. We have watched you adapt. We have watched you resist beyond all reason. Now, we end this. And with that, the world itself began to collapse. Humanity's last gambit, the apex were beyond war. They did not fight with weapons. They fought with reality itself. With each step they took, the rules of existence unraveled. Gravity fluctuated. Space distorted. Humans were no longer merely outmatched. They were unmade. But humanity had learned something. Something even the Veldrath had failed to understand. The apex were not gods. They were machines. Ancient, unfathomably advanced, yes. But still machines. And machines, no matter how powerful, could be broken. Reyes, the last surviving member of the original strike team, led one final mission. A desperate assault on the core of the apex itself, using the stolen data from the Hive and the fallen Warbringers. The Resistance had identified something crucial. The apex were not invincible. Their control over reality was not limitless. It was rooted in a network, a vast, interwoven consciousness that spanned the Veldrath's entire empire. The apex did not destroy. They reprogrammed. They were rewriting Earth, rewriting physics, rewriting humanity itself. But to do that, they needed a link. And if that link could be severed, they could be killed. The final assault, Reyes and his team did not fight the apex head-on. That was suicide. Instead, they went beneath the ruins of Tokyo, where the apex's influence was weakest. There, buried beneath the wreckage, they found what they were looking for: the Nexus, a towering, pulsating construct anchored to the heart of the apex itself, the key to their power. Destroy it, and the apex would fall. But the apex knew. As Reyes's team set the charges, they came. They did not walk. They did not move. They simply appeared. Towering, shifting masses of liquid energy and nanite swarms, their presence alone shredded reality. One by one, the strike team was erased. Not killed. Erased, until only Reyes remained. As the apex loomed over him, their voices burned into his mind. You are nothing. Your kind is nothing. This world is ours. Reyes smiled, and with his last breath he whispered, not today, and detonated the charges. The fall of the apex. The Nexus ruptured. For the first time, the apex screamed, not in sound, not in words, but in pure, raw terror. Their bodies, so unfathomably powerful, began to collapse. Without the Nexus, they were untethered, disconnected, incomplete. The reality they had rewritten snapped back into place. Across Earth, the remaining Warbringers shut down. their once indomitable forms reduced to lifeless husks. The Veldrath fleet reeled, their perfect coordination shattered beyond repair, and then they ran. For the first time in their history, the Veldrath abandoned a world. They did not retreat. They did not regroup. They fled. Because for the first time, they faced something they could not defeat. Not weapons, not numbers, but the one thing humanity had that they never could. Defiance, the dawn of a new era. The war was not over. The Veldrath still lurked in the depths of space, their empire spanning the stars. But they had learned fear. And humanity? Humanity had done more than survive. They had won. Earth was in ruins. The cost had been unfathomable. But the message had been sent across the stars to every empire, every species the Veldrath had ever crushed beneath their heel. We are not prey. We are not weak. And if you come for our world, we will fight, and we will win. For the first time in history, Earth was silent. The Great War was over. But it had not ended in celebration. It had ended in fire and ruin. A world left in ashes. The Veldrath were gone. Their fleet had vanished into the dark, their apex obliterated, their warbringers reduced to lifeless wrecks of twisted metal. But in their wake, they had left behind a broken world. Cities were no longer cities, only skeletons of glass and steel, shattered ruins haunted by the echoes of a war that had pushed humanity to the edge of extinction. Oceans boiled where orbital strikes had scarred the very crust of the planet. Entire continents lay buried beneath the rubble of what had once been civilization. The survivors walked among the ruins, their faces hollow, their eyes reflecting something neither victory nor defeat, only endurance. They had survived the end of the world. Now, they had to rebuild it. The last survivors, of the nearly 10 billion souls who had once called Earth home, fewer than 100 million remained. Scattered pockets of humanity, hidden in bunkers, underground tunnels, and deep space outposts, now emerged to find a world that was no longer theirs. It had become something else. The Veldrath had not simply conquered. They had rewritten. Even in death, their influence remained. The sky flickered with remnants of their technology, distorting light and sound, leaving entire regions of the planet in perpetual twilight. Reality itself had been fractured in places where the apex had exerted their influence for too long. Zones where time moved erratically, where physics twisted in impossible ways. The Warbringers' corpses, miles high, loomed like dead titans over the wastelands, their broken forms a constant reminder of how close humanity had come to annihilation. And then there was the question of the Veldrath themselves. The war had been won. But were they truly gone? A haunting silence. Across the ruins of the world, scavengers and scientists alike began the grim task of studying the remnants of their enemy. They dissected the broken Warbringers, stripped their remains for anything that could be salvaged. They ventured into the collapsed hive structures, searching for answers, for secrets, for some way to understand what had nearly destroyed them. But something was wrong. Wherever the Veldrath had fallen, their technology resisted decay. Wreckage that should have been rusted and ruined remained pristine, as if waiting for something. And strangest of all, no Veldrath bodies were ever found. Not in the wreckage of their ships. Not in the ruins of their great war machines. It was as if they had vanished, or worse, as if they had never truly been here at all. The message from the stars 3 months after the war's end, as humanity struggled to rebuild, the first signal arrived. It came from deep space, from beyond the solar system, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Not words, not threats, just 3 symbols. 3 symbols that repeated over and over in a pattern that was not random. It was a countdown. The war was not over. Humanity had won the battle, but the Veldrath were not dead. They had never fought to win. They had fought to test, to learn, to see if humanity was worth fearing. And now, across the black expanse of space, something was coming. Something greater than Warbringers. Something beyond the apex. Something that had been watching, waiting. And now, It was awake. Humanity's final choice. The survivors gathered in what remained of Earth's last great cities. Leaders, soldiers, scientists, scavengers. Everyone who was left. There was no debate, no argument, only a choice. They could rebuild, stay on Earth, fortify what remained, prepare for the day the stars turned against them once more, or they could leave. The Veldrath had come for their world. Now humanity would come for theirs. They had learned the truth. They could not remain prey. If they wanted to survive, they had to become the hunters. And so, from the shattered remains of old shipyards, from the salvaged bones of Veldrath technology, from the ingenuity and defiance that had carried them through the end of the world, humanity began building the first fleet. Not for defense, for war. The countdown was ticking, and this time, humanity would be the ones who came for their world.